I can tell you first off, to dispel one of the rumors out there, is that we're not interested in proportional representation for power. And I can tell you that very personally. You do not run for the BC Green Party if you think it's all about power. When I ran here in 2013, no Green had never been elected in any provincial legislature anywhere in the country. So the notion that somehow we're running for power simply was not on the cards. It's about running for principle, to stand up for values that you believe are being ignored. And for us, the key overarching issue is the issue of intergenerational equity. That is, we believe that in decision making, you must think about the long-term consequences of the decisions you make, not only the short-term consequences. I was motivated to run for our party precisely because I taught at this university a course called Climate and Society, which is a course put on by the School of Earth and Ocean Sciences. It was a course designed to explore the issue of climate change from a broad perspective, from the science, the economics, the social impact, what we can do about it, etc. And the reason why, towards the end of this course, I would frame the whole course as I'd frame the course as, with the science, and essentially boil the whole issue of global warming down to one question. And the question is this: do we, the present generation, owe anything to future generations in terms of the quality of the environment we leave behind? And so why I say that is that global warming is not an issue relevant to my generation. It really isn't. Like, if I just think about me, I couldn't care less about this. Because the actions I take today, or the decisions made today, will not affect my generation, but they'll have a profound effect on your generation. And I would say, in the lectures, there's three things you could do about global warming. One is, of course, you can vote. It's a system we have. The other is you use your wallet and send a signal to the market about the right direction you want it to go. And three is tell everyone you know to do 1 and 2. And with the issue of voting, I would point out that youth engagement in voting has been on the decline here in Canada, and I show charts, and I would ask class, how many of you voted? And in a broad class of over 100 people, you'd find about just over 50% would have voted. And that's relatively high for the youth demographic. And I'd ask the question then about, so why didn't people vote? And they'd say all politicians are the same, all they can think about is themselves. They're all, cynical questions. And then I would say that, it's a system we got. This is your issue. If you don't show up to vote, you're going to have the demographic, the seniors demographic, that show up between 70 and 80% each time to vote, determining the type of issues that they want to be dealt with. So you only have yourself to blame if you're not engaged in our democratic institutions. And after, having this lecture, I did it about 6-7 years in a row, I finally felt like a bit of a hypocrite when I saw what was going on provincially. And I'm sitting here pontificating about the importance of getting engaged and standing up for what you believe in. And so I ran for the BC Green Party, and out of principle. I didn't think I was going to get elected, but I did. And Judy was my campaign manager, so thank you, Judy. And since then I've realized it's the single most rewarding profession you can have, because if you put principle first and foremost, you can actually get a lot done. And here we are in this unique situation with a minority government. With that said then, so I never ran for politics trying to stump for proportional representation. I ran fundamentally because I believed that climate policy was not being thought through. People in British Columbia were not recognizing the economic opportunity associated with decarbonizing. And I felt I had something to offer in terms of an economic plan. With the party, the BC Greens, of course, have 6 guiding principles. One of those guiding principles is representative democracy. So essentially, we believe fundamentally as a Green Party that participation, proportional representation is critical. That is, the makeup of the governance is reflected in the makeup of the population that voted for the governing parties. We did not campaign actively in the last election on proportional representation. We did say that we would introduce it as one of our guiding principles. The BC campaigned actively on having a referendum on proportional representation. The BC Liberals, in the throne speech in 2017, also said that they would have a referendum on proportional representation. And it's somewhat ironic now that somehow this is something that they're not supporting in light of the fact that they actually did say they would hold a referendum. So why proportional representation? So I've sat in the legislature now for almost 6 years, watching what works and what doesn't work. And in the first 4 years I was there, I watched with dismay as abuse was hurled back and forth across the legislature. Nobody was interested in working with anybody, with the NDP Liberals. We were just not interested in working together. The government was really being run by not only the cabinet, but the leadership within the cabinet. I was finding out from briefings and learning more about policy than the own backbench were. And it was essentially a government that was running, doing what it wanted with really very little accountability, because there was no good ideas could be brought to the table by opposition, and more often than not, they were ignored. We came to this situation now where we are in the legislature, and I tell you, I am not somebody who would have thought 3 years ago that I'd be sitting in a minority government supporting an NDP government. It was just so foreign to me. I had a very personal bad experience during the last election campaign when the NDP were going personally attacking me, claiming I was doing things I was. It was just horrible. I witnessed the BC NDP in the 2009 election on the tax campaign, and I was quite cynical. But what has happened in the last 2 years, well actually a little over a year and a half now, is initially the NDP were governing like with a majority. There was some tension between our parties until we learned what this meant to actually be in a minority government situation. And what has happened and emerged over the last, I'd say 6 months, is a recognition that we can actually do far more, and it is far better when we actually focus on what we agree upon and work collaboratively to build upon that as a base, because that is the foundation for compromise and collaboration. When you start by focusing on what you agree on, and then you can start to move forward on that. There's a ton of things that we've done in the BC legislature in this minority government that would not otherwise have occurred. One that's probably relevant to you there's a couple of things, the speculation and vacancy tax. You might have heard about it, but that had some very serious implications that by working together, we got tempered so that was, what we believe is a very palatable policy is now put forward. There's been work on elimination of big money in politics. There's been work on, you'll see a lobbying reform coming next week, environmental assessment being revised. And most exciting of all for me is the Clean Growth Strategy, which is going to be announced later this fall, which is essentially our economic vision for BC. In the last election, the BC NDP did not really campaign on an economic vision. They campaigned on putting people first, and they campaigned on not being the BC Liberals, and campaigned on building schools and hospitals. We campaign on offering an economic vision grounded in our strategic strengths. We're starting to see that implement in the Clean Growth Strategy. And for me, that's exciting, and it wouldn't have happened unless we were in a situation like this where we were forced to work together. So why am I personally for proportional representation? Well, I like what's going on in the BC legislature. I like it when people have to work together. I like it when strong positions are tempered because they won't be supported unless they're actually consensus is built. And I think it actually leads to better democracy. Sadly, right now, there is no representation from Greater Victoria in the BC Liberal caucus. I say that sincerely. And sadly, right now, there's no representation in government from the Okanagan. I say that sincerely as well. That's because in our first past the post system, you end up having these so-called safe seats always going to one party. And depending on who forms government or not, entire regions are represented in government or not. So you will hear, this is not good for rural representation. It's quite the opposite. It's very good for rural representation when you ensure that the legislative makeup reflects the kind of makeup of the electorate. If 40% of the people did not vote, between 40 and 50% did not vote for the BC Liberals in the Okanagan, you would get a legislature that reflected 40 to 50% today in government, and in the last, prior to that, in opposition. And it's healthy to have regions represented both in government and in opposition. So we have this referendum before us. Have you all received your ballots? Has anyone received their ballots yet? Really? I haven't checked my mail today. I'm excited to get it. So a few of you have. They're starting to roll out. We have 3 choices. We have, again, it's not very complex. The first one says, do you want to change or not? Like yes or no. It's not like you need to have a PhD in neuropsychology to figure out a yes or no answer. The second question, of course, is a little more complex. It's which of these do you prefer? And there's three types, one of which is standardly used across the world. That's called mixed member proportional, where you have two types of MLAs. One MLA is a local one, the other is representing a district. The other, there's two types, it's closed lists and open lists. You can either vote directly for all people or you can vote for parties. The other one is dual member. Again, it's really simple stuff, right? In dual member, you take, for example, Saanich North and the Islands, and you combine it with Saanich South, and you now have one riding called, say, Saanich and the Islands. And then Victoria Swan Lake might merge with Oak Bay Gordon Head, and you'd have one riding. And each party would run two candidates in that one riding. The first candidate would win by first past the post. And then what would happen is once you've done this everywhere, basically you double the size of ridings in cities, you leave them the same up in rural regions. You have the first past the post for the first person. Then the second people are elected. The rest are determined based on, or half the MLAs are determined based on percentages. So if you found that in every riding in Greater Victoria, 40% on average voted Green, 40% voted NDP, and 40% voted Liberal, you'd end up finding probably no difference, very little difference in the makeup of the legislature, with the exception that you probably would have one Liberal from this region done. And who is chosen is based on where you get the pockets of strong support for a particular candidate. So that, for example, in the Kootenays, the BC Greens are quite strong. So we would probably have got a seat in the Kootenays. We're also quite strong in the Okanagan. We probably would have got a seat there. We're not very strong in northern BC. That probably would not have given a read. And conversely, the Liberals are not strong in Vancouver, but Island, they probably would have got a seat and so forth. The third one is one that, to be blunt, I don't like. It's one that has two types of elections. One is singular transferable vote in urban BC, and the other is rural BC, and the other is MMR here in urban BC. I don't believe personally that we should have a system whereby if you move from one city in BC to another, you change this type of voting. So I can't. I'm not going to stump or pitch for that because I can't stump or pitch for that because I just think it's not something that I frankly can support. So I can live with either of the other two. They're relatively straightforward. They're used around the world, and I think they lead to better governance because it forces people to work together. Finally, I'll say that you'll hear that somehow proportional representation will lead to the rise of so-called extreme parties. That's not going to happen, and we have a threshold of 5% for a party to get a seat in the legislature. Even the Conservative Party had less than 5% of the vote in the last provincial election. They probably would go up a little bit, and they might get a seat or two, which would be healthy. But even the BC Conservatives were not able to get the 5% threshold. So the notion that somehow the Nazis are coming is just so offensive. But you're hearing that on the no side. In fact, there's a video out there. Has anyone seen it? With the goose stepping. It's just, it's so outrageous that it's probably making people swing to the yes side, left, right, and center, because when you read it, you realize, what are you afraid of? Well, what the BC Liberals are afraid of is that their party will actually break into two parties. It's a very loose coalition of federal Liberals, federal Conservatives, Libertarians, and so forth. And that ultimately is what I would believe is some of the concerns that we're seeing with the BC Liberals on this. Well, with that said, obviously I'm supportive. I'm happy to answer any questions you have on any aspect of this or on any other issue.